Are live. Action.
I'm just waiting for YouTube to update. I don't know if we're actually live. Are we actually live? Excellent.
We're actually live.
Hello. Welcome, everybody. Minor glitch at the beginning there. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Product Dynamics session this month on neurodiversity with Chris Sterner, who's here with us, as well as Jason Knight, Product Dynamic co-founder. Before we get started, we're going to give people a couple of minutes just to join. But if you're there and if you're listening, let's try a little ice-breaking exercise. Say hello in the chat. Tell us where you're from. Where are you calling in from, Chris?
Melbourne. Should I put it in the chat? I'll be the...
Excellent. And where are you, Jason?
I am in London, UK, and the hottest day of the year, so I've heard. So this is going to be an exciting one. I'll try not to melt by the end of the presentation.
Well, I'm in Brighton, and it's probably just as hot here. Excellent. So people are starting to join again. Excellent. So just a couple of things before we get started. This is going to be recorded on the same URL where you were watching it. So if you have to drop off, or if you want to watch it again later or send it to a colleague or a friend, you can absolutely do that using this same URL. We are going to have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, stick around or just drop it in the chat right now, and we will get to them later. And with that said, Chris, I think we are ready for you to start.
Cool. Awesome. So, well, thanks for having me here today. Really appreciate that. I'm going to zip through some slides, have a bit of a chat, and then, we've got a Q&A at the end. So if you've got any questions, we're going to cover them then. If I can figure out which button to press, get this to work. There we go. So neurodiversity and work. So what I really want to kind of try and get you through today is really a shift in perspective. So this isn't about like lots of detailed content. It's not lots of tools and techniques and strategies and any of that sort of stuff. It's really about, if you are new to this idea of neurodiversity, what it is, what it doesn't mean. This is really what I want to get you started around. And it is really that what you can see there on the left, feeling confused, unsure, uncertain. So, having a bit more clarity and having a bit of a line of sight around how neurodiverse staff could be impactful in your workplace and what looking after and supporting them might actually look like. So where do we start? So for me, this whole process of getting involved in neurodiversity inclusion started with my two boys, and that is actually them. No, they do actually take after me somewhere. Maybe it's not as obvious these days, but and look, my two kids, they're fantastic. Couple of boys, young, they're energetic, they're curious, they're funny, they got a propensity to laugh way too much at fart jokes, the usual sort of thing that you would expect at kids their age. And the thing is, though, that between the pair of them, one of them is not quite the same as the other, and one of them is always going to stand out. And look, that for us, that came as a result of understanding that he had got a diagnosis as being autistic. And for me, then looking into, well, what does that all mean? And a lot of that, for me, that was what I became really aware of was the implications when it comes time for work and the challenges around gaining and retaining employment. And that a lot of that isn't in relation to the autistic person's capabilities or intelligence or anything like that. It's more about the systemic challenges that everyone else seems to have in terms of understanding someone who's different and how they set up an environment that enables them to thrive. And it just ends up creating lots of challenges. And so for me, that was really the impetus to get involved and do something to try to make that situation for him a little bit better than what it might otherwise be. And as you can see there, so I felt like I would rather regret doing something than sitting back waiting for somebody else to do something and not happening and having a regret about that. So even if I spectacularly failed at trying to make a difference, I thought it was always going to be worth having a crack and try and do something. And I think, as parents, we all want our kids to have more opportunities, better opportunities than we've had. And I think that's really, really what this stems down to. So I talked about that unemployment rate and the challenges around gaining employment. Now, these are statistics from Australia, but to be honest, looking at other countries, and statistics are always a bit of an interesting thing, but they're largely the same for all developed nations. There is essentially a 5 to 7-fold increase in the unemployment rate for those on the autism spectrum, right? So, and when you go look at people who may be ADHDs or have dyslexia, etc., it doesn't get any better, right? So there are a lot of people who are facing either persistent regular unemployment or long-term unemployment because their minds just work a little bit differently. So what is neurodiversity? Judy Singer, an Australian sociologist, she coined this term back in the late 90s, and for Judy, who herself actually is autistic, it was really about having another way of understanding how people are different. Right, so we already have some very obvious differences around gender and race, etc., and an understanding of that our minds, our brains, our cognitive processing can actually be different, and it is a fundamental difference of humanity, right? It's not that there's something wrong. It's not a deficiency. It's not a deficit. And I know a lot of the literature and a lot of the diagnostic criteria focus on what a person cannot do, relative to arguably an arbitrary benchmark of what good looks like, and that's that focus. But really, this is just a matter of saying, another way that we are different is our minds work differently. You've got a list here. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, but it's some of the ones that are probably more obvious for people more familiar with things like autism, dyslexia, ADHD, etc. They're ones that people would most come across. But neurodiversity can include a whole range of differences that may be temporary, they may be permanent. They may be something that you were born with and are lifelong. They could be acquired, like an acquired brain injury. Many people with an acquired brain injury can present and have similar challenges and different processes, cognitive processing, that someone who is autistic or has ADHD, for example. It can be very similar in many, many ways. And ultimately, like the challenges that they're going to have with working into society generally are very similar. Now, I don't want to put people in a box here. It's like the last thing I'd want to be doing here. But if you were to draw some generalizations, in terms of some of the characteristics that you'll often find with people who are neurodiverse, is that being direct and honest, hyper focus and attention to detail, and it's really, really interesting when you look at people who may have ADHDs. There's often this misnomer that they have no focus. They can't pay attention to stuff. Whereas actually that is absolutely not the problem at all. If you speak to anyone with ADHD, you'll find there are many things and many times that their challenge is actually shifting their focus. They can get very, very focused on something that's of interest to them, and the same with people who may be autistic. But it's more about controlling the focus, controlling the thoughts, and not having them running all over the place and going places that maybe aren't helpful for right now. Loyal and energetic and those sorts of things. So you'll often find that a lot of people who neurodivergent people do have quite a strong sense of social justice and a strong sense of loyalty to people who are around them, who support them, and their organisation that they work for. So and that can play out in terms of the degree of, or the extent to which they might take sick leave and the like. They'll often be the first ones to stay at work. Now, I'm expecting that most people probably have heard of this idea of the autism spectrum, right? And we have this idea of, it's a sort of a continuum, a flat playing field that goes from low functioning to high functioning. And this is a paradigm that in many ways is quite flawed. Let me explain that, right? So when you think about someone who is, otherwise, low functioning, the inference is that they are incapable of doing things. They may lack intelligence, they may lack ability, they need a high level of support. And maybe the only thing in that's actually true is the degree of support that they require. Just because someone has a high level of support that they may need to do, their daily bodily self-care, feeding and the like, getting around at the shops or other things, doesn't mean they don't actually have something valuable to contribute, that they don't have the ability to think and create and the like. And equally, when we go up to the other end of this sort of continuum, we think about these high functioning people, the inference there is, well, they don't need any help. They're okay. They can cope. They can manage. They don't have any problems. And actually, that's quite often not the case whatsoever. So yes, their support needs may be far lower. Yes, they may be able to manage most situations much better, but it doesn't mean that there aren't changes and adjustments that would be valuable to help them better manage their work or their home life. And it doesn't mean that there are going to be periods of time where their support needs actually increase. Where stress levels have gotten too high for too long a period of time, whether they're tired and hungry or just overstretched, that they're going to need a greater degree of support, and maybe they're not going to be as functional as they might normally be. So it's a flawed system, a flawed paradigm. It doesn't really help us understand how people actually are different and what they can contribute versus what they may need in terms of support. The other thing that you often hear is that, oh, well, we're all a little bit autistic, or we're all on the spectrum somewhere. And in many ways, this is a lot like saying to someone, well, we're all just a little bit pregnant. You kind of either are or you aren't. And I think this is the same. This applies to neurodiversity as well. It's a binary situation. Yes, there may be instances where you can empathize with someone. You may share some similar characteristics. You may have similar experiences at time. But what it comes down to is it's a broader thing, right? It's not just, oh, well, I really don't like going out and socializing. Maybe you're introverted. That's okay. It's what is the degree of anxiety that you feel about having to go to a social function? How much does that anxiety actually impact your ability to operate in a situation like that? Is it almost disabling in the degree of that anxiety that you just, it's so overwhelming that even the thought of trying to leave the house to go to that party is just something you can't move beyond, versus just feeling a bit uncomfortable, not really liking it. And that's the difference. You either you are or you aren't. Another way to think about this whole paradigm, though, is something like this. And this is something I do recommend people go have a look at if they're interested. No association whatsoever with this at all, but it's a very interesting self-assessment that you can go through, and it's not a diagnostic criteria or tool in any way. So if you end up feeling like, or you're getting a result that tells you something, look, it's indicative based on research, but it's not a replacement for seeing a professional. But the idea here is that everybody shares common characteristics across a range of different dimensions. And these are the high level ones that you can see here. Each of these actually then gets broken up into subsets as well. Now, what would ordinarily happen with most neurotypical people or non-neurodivergent people is the profile that spider web actually looks quite round generally, much rounder, where every dot is landing in either the sort of the blue or the green. Blue or green being where there's a high degree of competency or skill. Towards the center at the red is where there's a high degree of challenge with that characteristic. And what you'll see with most neurodivergent people is that profile is very spiky. And this is a term that I'm starting to see, and hopefully others are starting to see a little bit more, is this idea of a spiky profile. And this sort of a model is where that really stems from. And what it does is, I think it helps, allows us all to see each other in the same way. Right? We all share these common characteristics. It's just our skill or capability or competency with them can vary. Right? So it's not that someone is different in a fundamentally different way. It's just like some people are good at playing sport and others are not, right? But we're still otherwise the same sort of people. It's kind of trying to get to that point of view. So why hire neurodivergent people or neurodiverse people? And what does this come down to? So 3 common business challenges, and I say business challenges, but it's really a challenge for any type of organization, whether it's a non-profit, whether it's a for-profit, whatever it might be, is this ideas of needing to drive productivity, innovation, and creativity is not new, but they're not going to go away. and the challenge that we have with trying to find new ways to solve for these problems, and the value that a diverse group of people can bring, and a truly a diverse group of people can bring, is thinking about these things collectively in very different ways, right? So you're trying to avoid groupthink, you're trying to avoid, people with the same ideas, coming from the same backgrounds, who have done the same courses and have been to the same places and the like. Is how do you break that mold and start finding new thoughts coming through? This was a study done out of Curtin University in Western Australia, out of Perth here, and it was across a collection. I think it was around 50 organisations that had hired between at least one and three autistic people at the time. It was when they did this, and what they saw was productivity gains and creativity gains there that you can see, sort of 50 to 80 and 32%. Now, this is not a gain of the neurodivergent hire relative to their peers. It's a gain across the entire organisation. And I think this is really, really interesting, because what it's telling me is that hiring, or at least in this instance, hiring autistic people for these businesses was driving productivity and creativity across the entire organisation. So having sort of 1, 3, 5, 6 people who fundamentally think differently, come at problems differently, but also may require their managers and their colleagues to think a little bit differently about how they engage with and support a peer, a colleague, a staff member, actually had a flow-on impact across the broader organisation. I think that's really, really interesting. And so, yes, whilst individually many neurodivergent people can be highly productive, more so than their neurotypical peers, it's this sort of this relationship impact that they can have across the organisation, which I think is really, really powerful. But why should we care as a hiring organisation or a manager or whatever it might be? Like, what does it really matter? And I just want to paint a really, really quick picture here. And it's just think about this. This is sort of the sort of ripples in the pond type idea. For everyone in neurodivergent person, on average, they're likely to have a sibling and 2 parents, right? So family of 4. And when you start extending that out, let's assume the sibling's grown up and has their own family, you've got a compounding impact here of the number of people that are associated. And this is just the immediate family group. And at 3 degrees, you're talking about 18 to 20 odd individuals who are immediately associated with that one person. So there's quite a large group of people here we're now talking about. You've just connected quite closely, and this isn't including friends and others, right? It's just quite closely connected to that one neurodivergent individual. And I think what's really, really interesting about this, though, is that these are the people who are likely to be staff, colleagues, peers in your organisation. Right? The number of times where I've sat down and had a conversation or done a training at an organisation, and the number of people who put their hand up and who can identify to say, yes, look, I have a partner, brother, sister, uncle, father, whatever relation in their family who is neurodivergent, and the fact that they're seeing their organisation take this seriously and starting to do something, especially for the parents. And I know this myself. I'm seeing that there are organisations who are trying to create opportunities and trying to create a different place for people who do think differently is really super encouraging. And the kind of the engagement effects of that within organisations, you kind of can't underestimate how powerful that could be. The other thing is that these people are quite likely to be your customers. Now, whether it's you're a service organisation, whether you sell products or goods or whatever it might be, these are the people who are consuming your products and services. And especially when you start thinking about the younger generations today who are far more socially minded, many, many more people are starting to make decisions on who they deal with, who they buy from, who they work for, based on the position they take around a number of these sort of social issues, what their stance is and what they're actively actually doing. So it's just something to keep in mind. So when it comes to recruitment, what's the big challenge? What are the problems? And it's really across 3 different areas. And it's things like job ads, application forms, and interviews. Now, these 3 areas can be really, really challenging, where we often don't make it easy for people who are neurodivergent, who think differently and who can often be highly self-critical And I know we all might say, oh yeah, but I find it really hard to sell myself, and I like, but it's kind of going back to that pregnant, not pregnant thing, right? So it's a degree of impact. It's how much that they go down a particular path, and particularly interviews, right? Where interviews are so often geared around demonstrating interpersonal skills. How well can you sell yourself? And how well can you build rapport, and often really, really quickly, with a complete stranger, is what it's all about. And these are skills and situations that are often just don't play to the strengths and effectively highlight some of those challenges that many neurodivergent people have. And recruitment ends up being really, really challenging. The other thing is around once someone is employed, they're in the workplace. And one of the things that I so often see, where typically where I've been involved in trying to help resolve a problem or a perceived problem between a manager and an employee, it comes down to communication, and particularly around setting expectations. Now, many neurodivergent people can feel challenged by change, can feel challenged by not knowing what's going to happen. When you've got people who may have a propensity at times to increased anxiety, anything that kind of adds to that just adds to or makes it even harder to function and work effectively. And I think we've all felt that idea. You know, if you've ever, like I have, you've parked your car at a large car park and you've come back out to try to find it, and it's not where you thought it was. And that kind of moment of panic and stress, and you're just not thinking straight. And it takes a little while for that to go away, and you can start thinking properly, and you realize actually you're parked it over there and you haven't lost it, your car's still fine. If you sort of exaggerate that impact and you think about how that then affects someone's ability to work effectively and get the outcomes that they need to, interact with people, etc., it just becomes harder and harder. There's lots and lots of simple strategies that can be done though to help reduce those unknowns and make things a lot easier to work through. The other things that you often see around communication is it's the way people interact, the way we use language, the way we ask questions can create tension, can create confusion. Often things like the way a person uses their voice, so pace and volume and tone. At times for some people, they may, what can often sound, for some people, they might hear a tone that sounds really, really angry. But for the person who's using that, quote unquote, angry tone, they're just actually really excited. They're really passionate about the thing they're talking about. But the way they're not as aware, or they're not as conscious or understanding of the way they use tone, and it can just come across wrong, and people misunderstand. And then you've got all sorts of miscommunication problems that then happen as a result. And it's just simple little things, just understanding how sometimes some people just communicate a little bit differently, and helping everyone being aware of that. So just to recap then, we've gone through really, really briefly an understanding of what neurodiversity is, why it can be helpful in the workplace, and touched on very quickly some of the barriers around recruitment and communications in the workplace. So look, this is just a really quick snapshot to get people I guess started, and happy to I think we've got Q&A time now anyway, Andrew and Jason, so we can delve through that. But if people want to know more about this or wanted to get into it any further, I'm always open to a chat later on as well.
All right, thank you very much, Chris. So I have a question before I go to some other questions. Question I thought about because of a book that I'm reading at the moment, which is all about the challenges of communicating in the workplace in these remote times. Mm-hmm. So the lack of context, the lack of social cues that you can get from, for example, text communications, Slack, email, and all the like. Now that's challenging for anyone. Neurodivergent, neurodiverse, neurotypical, like any single person can have an issue. And I certainly, from time to time, will get a message and I'll look at it and I'll go, well, they're just shouting at me or something like that. And it turns out that they're absolutely not, but they put a full stop in the wrong place or something like that. Is that something that you feel is exacerbated by some of the issues that you've been talking about so far? Like, so some of the ways that, say, for example, an autistic person would process that information versus someone who wasn't autistic, or do you think that that's just the same problem for everyone?
I think like I want to say, like, largely, if any one person feels like a thing can be challenging and can be a problem, probably any other person will also have a similar experience. I think what differs, though, is the extent to which you may feel confusion or misinterpret, or the propensity to misinterpret things it's the impact often is more, right? It's how much then the confusion about what have I read. Like, I've got a client that I've been working with at the moment. He had a communication come out from his manager. It was one of those sort of like strategic messaging type things, quite high level. Now, he was struggling in filling in the gaps, and his default, which is not uncommon, is to sort of plug the gaps with worst case scenario meanings for him individually, and then therefore now take an interpretation of what he's read, and then the world is now suddenly falling in on him when it was actually nothing like it at all. Whereas other people might read it and go, I'm not too sure what that's meaning. I'm a bit confused, a little bit nervous. Maybe I'll go and ask. Other people go, yeah, whatever, it's fine. It's all waffle anyway. We'll find out later. So different people can have a different response to that. But I think what I've seen more often is people who are neurodivergent, or particularly, not everyone, right? But everyone's different, but you may be more likely to have that more adverse response. Definitely.
So it's more about the, like you say, the scale of the problem. But I mean, it's the same problem, but just amplified more than anything.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you think about it in simple terms, right? So a noisy work environment. So that hub and that you often have especially in like common open plan offices that like we have here anyway, a lot of the time, it can be quite distracting for many people. And I think there was a study done out of Europe somewhere. I can't remember the specifics now, but where they did find that everybody is adversely impacted by background noise in a workplace. It's the extent that it's what they found, though, was that the average person doesn't realize they're being affected by it. They don't notice the noise and the distraction so much. So it's the same problem that exists for everybody. Everyone's experiencing it to some extent. It's that it comes back to like the impact of their experience. It's kind of like you kind of got these people who are humming along on a 1 or a 2 out of 10, and you've got a couple of people over here in 9s and 13s, and they're really struggling. So
I can definitely speak for open work distractions. I'm hypersensitive with sound, and everything, it could be really, really tiny, and I remember people thinking it was really strange that I would get annoyed at someone just tapping their pen. And I'm like, you have no idea how anxiety inducing that is for me, because that constant tapping cost a great deal of anxiety for me. And it wasn't until I think it was last year that I was finally diagnosed with, being atypical, which is not being on the autistic spectrum, but having some, characteristics of that, and also being dyscalculic, which, as someone who struggled with math skills for my entire life, like I've been known to cry at spreadsheets.
Light bulb.
I was like, oh, boom, I'm not stupid. It's just that my brain just works differently. Yeah. And now that I work remotely, I can control my environment, and I can control, how I react to things a lot better. And I know that was one of the questions that kind of came through offline is, how do I control my environment if some things are causing so much stress and so much anxiety? And it could be something as simple as someone talking to you if you're really concentrating on something and someone distracts you. That can cause a lot of anxiety as well.
Yeah, I mean, context switching is a known challenge for everybody, right? So what is it? You lose the amount of time that everybody, on average, that the average person will lose switching from one task to another. Whereas you're going to find some people, especially once they've gotten into the rhythm, if you break that, it could take hours for them to get back to that same point of sort of focus and concentration, whereas someone else might only take 10, 15 minutes. Yeah, so it's just understanding those little things and background environment. So I know that was a question that came up, Andrew, and it's really, really common. And so, Jason, yes, communication and probably the higher reliance on non-verbal, non-face-to-face communication may be exacerbating some challenges. But on the flip side, you're going to find that there's a lot of people who are probably finding working remotely is allowing them to really manage their work environment, their work hours, in a way that's really, really beneficial. So it's kind of, maybe it's a bit of a an ups and a downs game, but
Yeah, I remember having a chat with an autistic friend who was talking about that's easy. He works in product management. He has to work with users to kind of dig into requirements, interview them, and start to understand their use cases and so forth. And one thing that I was chatting to him about was sometimes he has to get someone else to effectively come with him to manage certain, for example, users that he's dealing with, because it's not just the employee or your colleagues and your friends that you're dealing with, but also just effectively clients or users. And does that add an additional then layer of complexity to this? Because obviously you don't want everyone walking around with a badge, but at the same time, there's going to be lots of people that you're interacting with on a daily basis through your work that are just not going to have any idea how to deal with this. And of course, because they're not in your workplace, they're not necessarily going to be in any of these, any of the initiatives that you're running in your own workplace. Like, are there any ways that we can kind of spread it? I mean, this is obviously a really tricky question, but like how we can kind of spread it in such a way that those can be kind of smoothed over somewhat, so that you can make how do you drop that into conversation without going down a rabbit hole effectively with suppliers or with customers?
I think it's interesting, right? And I don't think it is an easy thing, and it's going to be really, it depends as well. And I think it's largely going to depend on the degree that the individual is prepared to share that information. So if someone's really happy, and look, I know there are some people who are, and there are many people who are not. But for those who are, it may be quite empowering. I can imagine. I don't know, but to be able to walk into a client engagement, especially where that's going to be an ongoing relationship over a period of time, it's not just a one-off thing, and say, yeah, well, here's Bill. Bill's autistic and likes to work in these particular ways. And maybe there's someone who's working, because often it's probably beneficial to work in pairs at least, especially when you're interviewing, because you've got that ability to, okay, well, I heard this. How did you interpret that? You know, you can play back to it with each other. So that can be beneficial as well anyway, just to help translate maybe what was going on, what was being said, so you minimize potential misinterpretations. But I think being able to put it all on a table can help, especially if it's like, if there may be a need that at times, if things get, Bill may need a chance to just step out. Right, he may need to step out of that meeting or drop off that call unexpectedly without having to explain himself. And if you are able to put it on the table, and maybe you don't have to go all the way why, but if there's an opportunity to say, at times, Bill may need to step out, and you could always, I guess, you could window dress it a little bit, and well, Bill's got to take a phone call and step out to take the call if he needs 10 minutes, 15 minutes to kind of recollect himself before coming back in and maintaining the interaction. But yeah, maybe being able to be upfront about that may help long term. And there'll be plenty of people, I think, that candor, that authenticity is going to probably buy you more brownie points than how good a job you're doing. You know what I mean? So, don't overlook the potential of how that can really help build relationship as well. So, yeah, I mean, we like to deal with people, right? So,
yeah, I like that. That's a good tip. The stepping aside and creating that opportunity for the person to just walk out. We do have a couple of offline questions that came through if you want to flash them.
Sure. So one question that came through, I think, ahead of time was, what is the difference between neurodiverse and neurodivergent? or are they the same?
Yeah, and I need to update my slide. I realised that because I'm probably a bit inconsistent. So for those who are grammar Nazis, and if we get properly technical, neurodivergent is really referencing an individual who the person who exhibits the difference. We might say the three of us here right now, and everyone on this and watching this, as a collective, we are neurodiverse. We all have different neurologies. We all have different brains. We all think and operate differently. But you might say, let's say if I've got a box, 5 apples and an orange in there, I could say, well, the box is diverse because there's different fruits in there. But the orange is divergent because it's an orange and the others are apples. It's that. Right?
So we should be very careful with the.
So no, diverse is talking about a collective. Divergent is talking about the individual.
So a person is not neurodiverse; they're neurodivergent, but
technically
speaking,
yeah. But there are many.
Very good.
I was going to say within the neurodiversity community, there's a lot of people. There are some people who want to be very specific and technically accurate, and there are many people who are indifferent and will use the terms interchangeably. So look, it's one of those things. Yeah, some people will be particular, and other people won't really care too much. I was probably worried more about your actions than your words.
Yeah. I guess as long as the words aren't actively harmful, then that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
We had another question, which was, are there any recommended books to read around neurodiversity?
Yeah, there's a few around. Neurotribes is a really good one. Steve Silverman from memory. There's a new one that's coming. It's out. Neurodiversity and Work by mind blank. Neurodiversity and Work. It's got a really funky, colourful colour. That's a good one. Well, should be a good one to look at. And there's another one. I can't remember the name of the book now off the top of my head. It's not about neurodiversity per se. It was about difference and the value of harnessing difference. I'm just trying to look it up. I've got it on my book list here somewhere. And I found that really interesting read. Leave that one with me. If I remember, I will shout it out.
Thanks for the tip. I've just booked Neurotribes on my Goodreads so I can catch it. Excellent. If anyone has any other questions, please drop them in the chat. I understand some people may be having trouble with the chat, so you can always tweet at myself, at Jason, at the Product Dynamic, or through the LinkedIn page. For some reason, it seems some people are being asked to create a channel or something odd like that. But if you do have any questions, ask them now. Jason, I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add.
I'll give you that book. Matthew Syed, Syed, is the author, and it's called Rebel Ideas.
All right.
I really like that. It's like a whole series of stories about capturing and leveraging just people who are thinking and approaching things differently. So
excellent. I've shared the Goodreads link in the chat.
So I do have a question, more broadly speaking, maybe as a kind of an action that maybe people could take away, or people that watch this afterwards could take away, which is like, we've obviously spoken a lot today around some of the characteristics of neurodiverse people, some of the challenges that they could have at work, and some of the ways that we might help to surmount those challenges at work, because there are many things that companies can do, but of course not all companies are doing them yet. Now, in the best will in the world, some companies are going to be better at this stuff than others, but are there any kind of ground level initiatives or ground level ways to try and help companies make that change that you're aware of? Because there's obviously top down change, which is fantastic. Like if you've got like a diversity and inclusion officer, or if the CEO signs up, was that fantastic? But if they don't do that, are there any ways that you've seen work where people can kind of get a groundswell from the shop floor, basically, to help kick that off?
I think one of the most interesting and powerful things that people could do, or organizationally could be done. And look, I think you could do it as a grassroots activity, but it's going to require one or two people to be kind of pretty courageous. But if you could encourage a neurodivergent person to stand up and wave the banner, and it doesn't need to be, I don't think it needs to be across the entire organization and completely openly, but to provide a means, and maybe it's like a sort of an employee action group or engagement group of some sort. Where you enable people to have the conversation. You allow people to find each other and support each other. Yeah, I think that can be a small thing, in many ways, a small thing that can make a big difference in people. And I think, like with a lot of these things, it's not, you can't, even if it's mandated from the top, it's not the sort of thing that just changes overnight, because it's really about interpersonal connectedness and understanding. That's not something you can just run a webinar or workshop and everything changes. It takes time, it takes effort. And I think one of the things that really benefits that process is exposure. Because, often we are, let's say we fear what we don't understand. Right? And so, and people, it's very easy to make assumptions and judgments about things when we don't properly understand them. And so, the number of times I'll hear something about, oh, but if a person is autistic, then therefore assumption, bum, 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 bum. You would actually, have you had a conversation with them? Have you spoken to them? Have you asked them? How do you know? And I think we often forget that, well, because suddenly there's this label there that this person's no longer a person anymore. They're not human anymore. They're this label. Actually, there's still actually a person there. Why would you treat them any differently? Why would you do things any differently? Fundamentally, right? So
I have a question on that. Why do you think it is that there's these assumptions about neurodiverse people? Like they must be that way, or they must be that way, or, those assumptions that come up, like you said, about what they must be like.
I think I wonder to what extent it comes from sort of historic stigma. That's often, being dyslexic means, oh, well, people can't read, and they must be dumb and they can't learn. Or someone's autistic means that they're basically like a human robot with no feelings and empathy, and they're all good at maths and IT, and that's all they can do, and they don't like making friends. And so we have these sort of historic, truths. And then, a lot of the time, I think how much of that then gets played to in the media and the press. So you'll often see, I think it's like, in some ways, it's sort of the worst or the extremes of that difference is what gets highlighted as part of what we see in sort of popular media, rather than the fact that there's so many people who are, they're not like that at all. And they're still people. They still have the same sort of hopes, desires, and dreams that everybody else does. They still want the same sorts of things that everybody else wants. It may not be in exactly the same way. It may be different. So that desire for human connectedness doesn't go away. They're not sociopaths. But what friendship looks like and what that connection might just be different to what someone else expects. And so we then judge people based on our own expectations of what they should, how they should behave and how they should act. And often people don't always do that. But I think it's not really that dissimilar to a lot of cultural differences that you can come across. There's often cultural norms that can be quite conflicting with what we might expect people to do or think. Right? But we don't suddenly put them in a box and just assume that they're no longer human. We can kind of get our heads around that a little bit.
Do you think shows like Atypical, which has been on, and some of the other TV shows that have been out recently, helping to shift that a little bit? Because you're right. You go back to things like Rain Man and stuff like that, and it's and a lot of kind of the old stuff. I mean, yeah, I mean, sure they told a story, but they were telling a very specific story that they got extrapolated out to everyone. And while obviously there's been some controversy, for example, with things like Atypical, because the guy playing the autistic lead isn't autistic himself and is basically
not just that, but atypical is different than being autistic. I am atypical, but I don't necessarily have issues with, communicating or to that extent. So I think it also labels what it is to be atypical or what it is to be neurodiverse in general. It is a good show though. I like it, but I think it still mislabels certain things. But I like what Chris said earlier about how, because someone is neurodiverse, they must be good at, math. I'm neurodiverse and I suck at math. If anything, my neurodiversity is dyscalculia because I do not understand math. Numbers just confuse me.
Yeah, I haven't seen Atypical. I did watch a few. I've watched a number of episodes of The Good Doctor, like the first season of that, and then kind of couldn't keep going with it. But so I mean that was one show, but I think maybe they're trying to do the right thing. I think I think if it stimulates a conversation, you kind of got to go to some extent. That's a good thing. I think it's how you carry on the conversation that matters. And I think some of the challenges with shows like that is they do exaggerate the stereotypes, right? And so to go, oh, well, an autistic doctor would look like that dude in The Good Doctor. It's probably a fair bit of BS because the reality is there's probably a high proportion of doctors and surgeons who probably are autistic or do have ADHD. They are neurodivergent in some way. It's not uncommon for people who are lawyers, accountants, engineers, scientists, medical practitioners to be neurodivergent. It's not uncommon at all. But they're not going to present like that guy. They're not going to have this. They're going probably more likely, and I'm generalizing here, especially if you're in a medical, if you're working as a surgeon, to have gotten to that point and to be sustained success, you've probably more able to deal with the environmental pressures, right? So, being put off by the bright lights in an operating theatre and the like, and there's some of these other things that they portray in the show. What's probably wouldn't be an issue that person would actually have. They're probably more able to manage it. It may be stressful for them and they may go home at the end of the day really, really exhausted from it. But you know what? You've probably been, someone here today has probably seen and visited a neurodivergent doctor and never even realised it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a really valid point. I think it's that any stereotype. I think I agree with you what you say around it, as long as it starts the conversation. And I think the good thing around things like Atypical was that it showed, for example, an autistic person as someone who wasn't just a robot, but does have emotions and does have wants and needs and desires, which, whilst it may be stereotypical,
Sounds
is at
better.
least it's more positive than they're just really good at blackjack because they can count really fast or whatever. So hopefully we'll see some more shows.
I guess it's a little bit like back in the 80s when Crocodile Dundee came out, and that was the promotion to America of what Australia was like. It's kind of like, it's like a caricature. Do you know what I mean? So I think you kind of got to take sometimes with what you see in the media and in the TV shows and the like, is it's you got a pinch of salt.
Yeah, fair enough. And you've kind of touched on it before around people being able to contact you after this. Where's the best place for them to do that if they want to continue a conversation around neurodiversity?
LinkedIn is probably a good place to start. So you can find me on LinkedIn, or you can just go to neuroadvantage.com.au.
All right, we will make sure to put that in the notes if they're not there already.
I'd give you my mobile number, but I don't think people want to pay the international fees. So.
Well, with the time zone difference, I think that could get very unpleasant for one of us.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
It's been really fabulous, Chris, to have you on, and obviously really important topic as well. So glad that you could spend time. Hope everyone that joined us live got something out of it, and hoping that we'll be able to share this around and help to spread the good word as well. So genuinely, thanks for taking the time.
No, it was a pleasure, and thanks for having me on. It was great fun.
Have a good
Excellent.
day.
Thank
and
you
or
again,
evening as well.
Chris.
No worries.
Remember, everybody, that you can watch this back on this URL and you can share it as well. And like Chris said, if you have any questions, you can contact him through LinkedIn, or if you have the Product Dynamics Twitter or, again, LinkedIn contact, we can always help you get in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
All right.